Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I don't know, ordinarily these live discussions have been about an hour and a half. It won't be that long today because my purpose today is just to give a little bit of background and motivational introduction and to introduce Sue Lloyd, who will be joining us for our discussions, which is an incredible honor. Sue is the author of The Man Who Was Cyrano. Mine is very well worn and well marked up. A beloved book. I recommend it to everyone. And I learned this morning that it will be available on Kindle as of December 15th. Was that right?
That's pre-order from December the 15th. I'm not sure when it will be
actually available. Okay. Well, I encourage everybody to read this book. It's fantastic. And I think it's what got me to finally read Chantecler. So just a few comments, and then if anyone has questions you want to ask in the chat of me or of Sue, please feel free to do so. So I wanted to start by saying as motivation that I had long loved Cyrano de Bergerac before I read this play, and I loved Cyrano de Bergerac. I had taught it year after year, and I've said before that I think it's the first play that I felt like I actually did fall in love with the hero of the story in a way that felt like returning to reality was leaving reality for me. So I really, really loved Cyrano de Bergerac and his creator by extension. But I was very skeptical of Chantecler. I heard it referenced, and I knew it was the story. It was set in a barnyard, and the hero was a rooster, and it was much harder to imagine falling in love with a rooster than it was falling in love with Cyrano de Bergerac. So I didn't even pick it up for a very long time, and I'm pretty sure it was reading The Man Who Was Cyrano and hearing Sue at some point say that she regarded this as the truest expression of Rostand himself, even more so than Cyrano, that I thought, okay, it's time. I must read this. And I wanted to just describe a few hurdles that I had to overcome in case you face those hurdles too. So I did finally sit down to read it. And I had two major hurdles, one of which I hope you won't encounter at all, which was that I ordered one of those reprint copies through Amazon of the Gertrude Hall translation, which is the one I recommended just because of ease of access. But it was printed as Act 1, Act 3, I believe, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4. So the act repeated and they were out of order. And that was profoundly confusing, as you might imagine. So just do be cautious if you order a physical copy that the acts are presented in order. But also you are thrust, if you've read Cyrano de Bergerac, you know that the play opens at a play, and it's a kind of chaotic scene in a playhouse. And every year when I teach that, you read plays out loud together in class. And every year when I teach that scene is a little bit difficult to get started with because there's so much happening from so many corners simultaneously. And it's a little bit hard to get your footing. Now, of course, it's meant to be seen, performed on stage, and all of that would be immediately intelligible. But when you're reading it on the page, it's more difficult. And I think the same thing is true here, that it opens in a barnyard, and there are a lot of hens who are having conversations with each other. And it can be, you do sort of have to remember that this is meant to be seen on stage and take your time in getting a hold on what's happening. And for me, in case anybody does encounter that obstacle, the minute that Patu, the dog, was introduced, I was sold. I was very happy to be along for the ride. So, okay. I wanted to mention a few things about the history of the play. Oh, before I say that, one more thing by way of motivation. When I did complete this play, it became a rival in my mind with Cyrano de Bergerac, a rival in my heart, and maybe even the victor. I loved it so much more than I ever anticipated I would. And it's that it sort of goes back and forth because I keep teaching Cyrano de Bergerac and I haven't had the opportunity to teach this one, but I'm not entirely sure whether it was the timing in my life that made it have the quality of being a rival for my heart. But I did want to say that it came for me at a time in my life that its message was more personally powerful than almost any work of literature I've ever read. And I mentioned in my email that I've drawn inspiration from this play repeatedly at times when I need it most. It's something that I turn to as a reminder for inspiration. Now, that's all I'm going to say, because it's very important to me in these groups not to give spoilers of plot or spoilers of theme. I don't want to tell you what I think the meaning of this play is before we've even read it. I want to come to that understanding together inductively over the course of the weeks ahead. So I just want to caution other people in the group too, to please be careful of that. I think I've given warnings before that I discourage reading introductions. That includes Sue Lloyd also has this wonderful edition of Chantecler, which is in French. So alas, the introduction is in English, but it's a publication of the play in French, which I wish I could read. I'm not that proficient, but the introduction is absolutely wonderful, but I recommend waiting until the end of the play to read it if you get a copy of this. So I was delighted to learn that my skepticism was shared by Coquelin, who you may have heard that name before, famously played Cyrano de Bergerac 950 times over the course of his life. And I understand from Sue that this play was written with Coquelin in mind to be its star. So when Rostand first presented the idea to Coquelin, he said, "Is that serious?" And Cyrano and Rostand responded, "Very serious indeed." So, and I don't think anyone will have any doubt of that once you've read the play, nor did Coquelin, who became completely sold by it. And I have read, died with the play script in his hands. I don't know if that's I read it in one of the sources. I don't know if that's actually true, but I'd like to believe it's true. I think there are compilations of final words, famous final words, and it always seems like it would be nice to time your death with something symbolic, like holding the script of Chantecler in your hands. Yeah. I think
yes. He did actually die during rehearsals.
Oh, during rehearsals?
Yes. Well, he was rehearsing it on his own when Simone came along, and he had a heart attack or something. Oh. So he was going to play the cockerel. Yes, he was. Oh, yes.
Goodness. I remember reading that Ibsen, who's known just as such a iconoclast and contrarian, that his final words were "on the contrary." And then that was it. So we should all be able to time our final words so well. So a couple of other things about the play. Why barnyard animals? I loved discovering the reason because that was the reason for my skepticism, but it was also so deliberate on his part. And in the introduction by Kay Nolte Smith, I'm going to quote her. She says, "The genesis of the play," Rostand explained, "was nature herself. Out walking in the Basque country where he lived, he saw a blackbird hopping in a cage in a farmyard and seeming to jibe at a cock who entered the scene. Did the cock see the mockery? Rostand wondered. If so, what did he make of it? From that germ of comedy among animals, Rostand created what he later described as a drama of human effort grappling with life. So he saw a scene that had, the characteristic of human interactions that he saw going on around him. But then again, why choose to make them barnyard animals instead of human? And one of the things that I read is that, well, first of all, the cockerel is a symbol of France, and Sue says of pride and virility. So that was part of the idea. But also, he really wanted to write a play in verse. He preferred to write his plays in verse. He considered it the language of idealism. And if you've ever read the preface to Cromwell by Hugo, he very much agrees with that spirit and said that one of the best ways to fight against the commonplace or naturalism in art is one of the ways to protect it against naturalism is to write in verse. But so the challenge as described by Rostand was, I wish to write a modern play in verse at a time when people were becoming skeptical or disparaging of verse plays. And he said, now the lyrical qualities of a poetic production do not go well with the modern suit and the commonplace frock coat. It needs the additional costume. So he wanted to comment on modern society in verse and not be accused of having this kind of jarring juxtaposition. So what's the additional costume? Put feathers on them. And then we can justify having a play in verse. And it's another quote I have is that when he saw the barnyard blackbird and the cock, he thought, why, here was the costume dreamt of, if one can say so. Here indeed was the means of remaining modern and at the same time that of being picturesque and lyrical. Characters garbed in animal dress expressing themselves like human beings, like Parisians of the day. What a find. And furthermore, what an opportunity to speak of things in nature, to be deeply moved by flowers, birds, the bits of grass or the insect, and what a setting. No, really a poet could not wish for a more beautiful theme. So that's what all I want to say by way of introduction myself. And then I want to now introduce Sue Lloyd. I'll give a little background that I got from your book or from your website. Sue gained her honors degree in French at Bristol University in 1964, and then trained and worked as a teacher in the UK and in East Africa. She has a master's degree from the University of East Anglia for her thesis. Her thesis was Edmond Rostand's Success, Cyrano de Bergerac. What a wonderful topic for a thesis. She worked as an editor and a lexicographer and continued to research Edmond Rostand and wrote The Man Who Was Cyrano, A Life of Edmond Rostand, creator of Cyrano de Bergerac, which was published here in the US in 2003. And she has devoted much of her life to sharing her own enthusiasm for Rostand and his plays. And she has a website, which is the first thing, website and publishing company, which is the first thing I'll ask you about. What is the name of your publishing company and where does that name come from?
Right, well, it's the Genge Press, Genge. Genge is a family name. My father's mother was a Genge, and I identify very strongly with that side of the family. My best aunts were definitely Genges, and we actually live in their house, the house they lived in.
Okay.
So it had to be the Genge Press, yes.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
I've had to ask you that for a long time and hadn't, so I'm happy to know that now. And maybe, Joseph, if you haven't already, you can link in the...
Could I just mention, there's been some chat.
Oh, okay.
Can I just reply to some of the chat?
Absolutely, please do.
Yes. If you go to my website, you can buy my book much more cheaply than if you buy a secondhand copy on Amazon, because Amazon I reprinted it as a UK edition. I set up the Genge Press specifically to reprint The Man Who Is Cyrano. But Amazon does not like small presses. So I'm hoping now I have a Kindle version, it may actually condescend to sell the paperback at a decent price. Please don't spend hundreds of dollars on it. It only costs, how much does it cost? About £15, which is what, $17? The postage to America is horrific, of course. And the Chantecler that I've written has copious notes in English. So even if your French isn't very good, my Chantecler edition should help. And I'll just finally say, can I, the Genge Press website
please.
is Cyrano and Rostand, all lowercase, all one word, Cyrano and Rostand 2.com. It's 2 because the other one, the server stopped. So it's Cyrano and Rostand 2.com. And you can buy the book from the website and it will not cost you hundreds of dollars. So I'm just trying to answer some of the questions that were on the chat there. Yes. But let's read the play because it is my favorite Rostand play.
Yeah.
And if you loved Cyrano, that was his young man's play. And now this is his mature man's play. So I hope you'll all enjoy it as much as I loved it.
So a few things. I did previously have a small book group with Shoshana and Robert Mayhew and Ann Ciccolella, and Sue joined us. And part of the reason, well, first of all, when I read The Man Who Was Cyrano, I thought I must know this person. I must make an effort to know this person. So very happily I now do. And I invited her with the great hope that she would discuss this play with a small group with me, because it's one that I've always had at the forefront of my agenda for Read With Me, but I love it too much for me to have covered it so far. It's been intimidating to cover it because I've felt like I wanted to do justice to it, and there are parts of it that I struggled with a bit. So that was enormously helpful to me, and I know how helpful she'll be in these discussions. Sue, the first question I'd like to ask you is, how did you discover and fall in love with Rostand? It's very uncommon, I think, for people to encounter him, certainly in schools today, but just in life in general.
Well, actually, I did encounter Rostand when I was at school. And it was not actually Cyrano, it was from Chantecler. It was the Hymn to the Sun. And when I read that, I thought, I can understand this man because he's coming from where I'm coming from. The Hymn to the Sun comes into the first act. And then, of course, later on, I did see Cyrano on stage. I've seen, well, quite a few performances, as you can guess. I wouldn't want to miss one. And I just thought, Rostand is the kind of writer that everyone really should read, because he is such a contrast with our modern materialistic society. He is an idealist. He has a vision of what it's like to be a true human being. The vision of an ideal is very important to him. And so I just identified with him. Yes.
And so at what age in school they introduced that almost as a poem standing on its own, the Hymn to the Sun?
I can't honestly remember. We did have a wonderful French teacher who taught us French songs, which is a very good way of learning the French endings to adjectives and things. And it must have been her. Yes.
Okay. So you were introduced to the Hymn to the Sun and then started reading Rostand's work on your own after that.
Well, once I decided to study Rostand for my MPhil, and I'd already done some teaching by then, I just thought, what a wonderful subject for a thesis. So then I did start reading all his books, all his plays, and they're all in verse, because he is a poet first and foremost. He thinks of himself as a poet. But then he found the theatre was an ideal vehicle for his ideas.
Okay. Is there anything that you want to add about the background to Chantecler, to what I said?
Well, at the same time he was writing Chantecler, he was living in the countryside. He left Paris to get over a terrible illness. It was pleurisy, and in those days, very, very serious. So he went to live in the Basque country, in the countryside, and regained his childhood love of nature. And you'll find all through Chantecler that he just loves nature and lots of things. Sorry, it's very chilly here. We've all got colds. So at the same time, he had decided then to make his home in Cambo-les-Bains, which is in the Basque country. And he was building a wonderful villa called Arnaga, which you visited, Lisa. And so he was doing two things, really. He was writing Chantecler, and he was drawing up this villa, and he was so involved. He was very involved right from the start with his villa. And the other thing to remember is that he couldn't write it all at once because he had periods of depression, something he'd always suffered from. So it took him a lot longer than he thought. And unfortunately, it was too long for Coquelin, who just couldn't last until it was written. So, yes.
I recall reading in your book that there were a lot of obstacles to the production of the play too, that it took a very long time. There were a lot of rumors about it circulating. Is there something you can share about that?
By his very success, Rostand had made enemies, and the enemies would seize on anything at all to scorn him and bring him into disrepute. And they took the time it took him to write it, and this is because he kept having depression. He was also building Arnaga, and there were various physical things. It was a very complicated set, and it took a long time. On the website, on my Chantecler page, there's some pictures of the set, and you can see how complicated it was. And the costumes are very realistic. They took a lot of fitting and making as well. And really, he didn't really mean it to take so long. And then it was nearly ready, and then there were floods, and the theatre was flooded. And so on and so forth. It was one setback after another, and then Coquelin died, and he had to find someone else. And the man he could find was not whom he would have wished at all. And this all contributed to the performance. Well, I'd rather not say it in the moment anymore.
Okay. And have you ever seen a production of Chantecler on stage?
I'm afraid not. No. There have been a few in France, which I couldn't get to. I was actually in East Africa, but I did read reports, and apparently they were tremendous success, tremendous. Yeah. So it is, and there's only ever been one in England, and I'm not sure ever in America, except by a puppet theatre, which I'll look up and let you know later.
Okay, interesting. What is there are many translations of this play, and I think I have all of them, and I think I've read all but the one that you recently recommended, and I do have a copy of. But what is your feeling about the various translations of?
Well, for a start, I would never buy one of those awful reprints that you can get. Please don't do that. And the other thing is, the earliest translations are not very good because they were done in such a terrible rush. So even if you can get a reprint, I would recommend the much later ones. The one that we used last time when we had a seminar, I've forgotten who it was though. Who was it?
Did we? I think we had different translations actually. Shoshana, do you remember?
We did remember too.
Or were we using?
Well, I guess my memory is that I was using the French.
Let me just have a look.
Oh, you were using the French.
Yeah, okay. But I think we had you and I both acquired a very rare one. Right. There were like 2 copies in the country, and we got both of them.
Yes.
Yeah.
that one is here. And Sue had recommended this one by John
Oh.
Newbery.
John
Yeah.
Strong Newbery, I fully recommend him.
Um,
1911.
The problem
This
is
is very good, and it's in verse.
it's virtually impossible to acquire. You had recommended it to us, and Shoshana and I bought up the last existing copies. But if you all, we're going to lose everyone right now. They're all going to leave the session and go try to find John Newbery. Maybe if I would.
Well, the other one was quite good, and that was the one. The other one I've got is by Clifford Bissell and William Van Wyck, and that's quite good as well. And that's a joint one. It's got Cyrano in as well. That was 1947. But
is the one on Project Gutenberg any good?
Well, that's the one, that's probably one of the earliest ones that she's saying is not one of the best, but I will say that the first I ever read was Gertrude Hall, and that's when I fell in love with the play. So it's at least possible to
must
fall.
Be better than I thought.
It's at least possible to fall in love with it through that translation.
Yes,
but
yes.
I've now read so many, they're all kind of mingled in my mind. Because there is.
So what I'll do at the very least is I'll post the Project Gutenberg one in the Read With Me app. So at the very least, if you go into Read With Me, you'll be able to read the version in there.
And maybe I can send out a list of the various translations that are available out there, because the other Kay Nolte Smith, who was friends with Ayn Rand, wrote a
to be good.
She wrote a verse translation. But that one too is
very hard to get.
Very hard to get. Yes, they are very hard to get. Of course, if you're capable of reading it in French, that's what you must do.
There's a very good paperback edition in French of Chantecler by a very good man. Yes, Philippe Boulage, very good.
Okay. Yeah. But I know, so at my daughter Greta is here, and at her school, Thomas Aquinas College, they don't make they allow students to read different translations of the same text, and sometimes it can lend something very interesting to the discussion to have read different translations of it and see. And then we do have people here who are able to read it in the French and set us straight when our translations go awry. So just read what you can get a hold of, and it will make for a really good conversation. Well, I know the answer to this question in some sense, but I'd still like to hear what you have to say about it. What are we missing by not reading it in French if we read an English translation?
Well, of course, it is poetry, and some of the things like the hymn to the sun, but also later on when the cockerel in Act 2 is evoking the dawn, calling to the dawn. That is a wonderful long speech in French. It's very hard. I've tried to translate it into English. It is very hard. You really need to be a poet, I think, to translate Chantecler. Yes, but yes.
There must be a lot of, I know there are a lot of puns in the play, because the blackbird makes a lot of puns. So I imagine some of that, a considerable amount of that is lost too, just the little humorous turns of phrase.
And yes, and also, yes, that's very difficult to translate, of course, a pun, but also he was writing for his own times. So this is 1910, and he particularly criticized some of the fashions that were going round in Paris at the time. And one of them was to speak English. So that, I don't know how that's going to translate, but yes. Actually, it's interesting because he gives the blackbird the puns, and in past plays, Rostand was criticized for having too much wordplay, because he loves words. He loves to play with words. He just loves it. So now he has a chance to indulge his love of wordplay in the blackbird. But he
and not be criticized for it because it's in the mouth of a villain. That's interesting. Tell us also what you're working on now. I know you told me you have a Rostand related project. that you're working
Well,
on?
I'm actually so desperate for people to read Chantecler. I am going to attempt a translation once we've moved house. Now, I'm going to cheat a bit because I think the John Strong Newbery translation is so good, and it's out of copyright next year. I could perhaps modernize it a little bit. I don't know. I'm going to have a go anyway. I'm going to have a go. But yeah.
So it is in copyright, because that was my other thought. Since copies are impossible to get, would I be able to share, scan and share? But if it's still in copyright, I suppose not.
You don't have a copy of this John Strong Newbery? You do, yes. Well, maybe we should both work on it, Lisa, because you're very good at translating yourself.
Well,
Yes,
thank you. I am hard at work on a difficult translation myself, but there was something else. So you put aside, there was something else that you were translating, I believe.
I was going to attempt a translation of Les Romanesques.
Okay.
Very early play. And like you, I bought one of these photocopied things, and it was appalling. It really was hard, impossible to work from. But I do have, of course, the original. I think I just gave up on that because I thought really Chantecler is so much more important. Les Romanesques was a bit of fun. It made him a person in the French theatre. He won a prize for it. His name became known. He was introduced then to Sarah Bernhardt, and his career went enormously improved then. But no, I'll leave that to someone else. Someone else might enjoy translating that. Okay. Chantecler is more important.
And just so people know, Les Romanesques is the Romantics. That's one of the translations of it, and that is available in the Read With Me app. We read it. There's a kind of cast reading of it with my staff. So if you want to have some fun, it is a very fun play. And the last question I'll ask you is a big one, but just if you could say a few words about why you think the world could benefit from Rostand's work today.
Well, we are facing the biggest challenge human beings have ever faced with climate change. And we have to become aware of that. And I think if Rostand could see the danger that the natural world is in at the moment, he would be horrified. And reading Chantecler, no one can fail, I hope, to be inspired by his love of the natural world. And he also is so much needed. His idealism is so much needed by the modern world. We are so cynical and flippant, and you know, we need to change our whole attitude, really. And it's getting more and more urgent that we do. And so Chantecler is an important read for everyone.
It is, since I've given a caution against plot or theme spoilers, it is difficult to talk about the value of it without giving those. One thing I'll say for myself is that I was recently listening to something in which an intellectual was complaining about the kind of superficial approach to morality and to virtue that seems to predominate in the culture today. And I see that as significantly the consequence of problems in education, and a sort of lack of, I would say, moral and intellectual rigor that is introduced to, there's a lack of moral and intellectual rigor in the whole educational experience. And so in general, part of the reason that I started Read With Me is that I wanted people to become deeply engaged with great literature in a way that creates that habit of being very thoughtful and careful and deeply connected to moral issues, and not just flippant and casual and kind of seeking a sense of virtue or moral meaning into an easier way. Virtue signaling has become a common word in our modern vocabulary, and I think with very good reason, because I think virtue signaling is replacing virtue to a dangerous degree. So I think that's one of the values that I see in engaging with great literature generally. But with Rostand, you have the additional sense of optimism, idealism, reverence for the human potential, reverence for beauty. So this combination of take moral issues very seriously and be very thoughtful about them. And the result is life can be sublime and wonderful. So
can I add to what you've just said? And Rostand explained when he was received into the Académie Française that all his plays were meant to be lessons for the soul, leçons d'âme, lessons for the soul. And as we read Chantecler, we'll find out what particular lesson he's teaching. I won't say now, we'll discover it as we read the play.
Wonderful. All right, are there any other questions from people here before we close? And then, of course, the first assignment will be Act 1, and that's what we will discuss next Sunday. Joseph, do we have anything in the chat that needs to be addressed?
No, I'll just make a couple of comments before we take some hands. So I will put the Project Gutenberg version in the Read With Me app, and it will be broken down by each assignment. So you have to figure out what to read. And I'm having some trouble with my chat, but I'll post the links to Sue's websites on the Facebook group, and I'll send them on an email as well.
Okay.
And we have
also, I know the Facebook group used to be an active component of Read With Me, and then it sort of faded away as I got engaged in other projects, but I do intend to pay close attention to any discussion in the Facebook group. So I'll put up a post related to Act 1 where people can make comments, ask questions, share thoughts, and then I'll be sure to read and reflect on those before we meet next week. So just know that that is an available resource for discussion before the discussion next week. We have a few questions, it looks like. You want to call on people, Joseph?
Yeah, Ray.
Hey. I was just curious about what Rodin's relationship is with a lot of contemporary writers of his time, especially ones who had a very different attitude towards life, like Zola or Maupassant or Huysmans, and what was their opinion of each other?
During the Dreyfus affair, Rostand supported Zola. He had no quarrel with Zola at all. The people who seemed to denigrate him were the very young people who were trying to make their own way in the theatre. Some of them didn't even bother to read Cyrano. They just assumed because, that it wasn't worth reading, and because it was so popular, it wasn't of interest to them because everybody loved Cyrano and they were above that sort of thing. He garnered more enemies as he went along, but those tended to be the people who later on in the 60s admitted they were wrong.
Were there any realist writers like Zola or Flaubert or anyone else that Rostand particularly admired or hated? Or
no, funnily enough, it was the idealists who did not like Rostand at the beginning. They thought you shouldn't live life, you should have visions and not really take part in ordinary life. Whereas Rostand all along said, have your ideals, but live them. Don't try and avoid life. Use life, live it to the best, keep up to your ideals if you possibly can. Whereas the symbolists just they were just thinking, they weren't acting, they didn't want to act in the real world at all. Whereas Rostand is all about living in the real world, but having an ideal in front of your eyes all the time.
like which symbolists, like Maeterlinck or
Well, I'm trying to think of I'm trying to think of the French ones at the time, but they were so insignificant. Their names have been forgotten. They just made no impression, really. No.
Thank you.
Jose.
Oh yes, I just want to make a quick comment that I do own a copy of A Man Who Was Cyrano, and maybe 8 years ago I started reading it, but I couldn't get past the first few pages because I was researching, I was Googling everything. So like, for example, his Spanish influence, so I was looking up Lope de Vega and Calderon and Quixote, and so I did not finish it, but it's because I was very creative at that time. What interrupted it was I wrote a screenplay based on the Romantics, and then I started writing other movies. So it was a very creative period, and I have to take that book out of storage soon.
Yes,
so I will read it.
So that's sort of a mixed compliment. I didn't finish your book because I was too inspired by it.
Exactly.
I think the first chapter is probably not the best anyway. You know, you could always skip the first bit until you got to Cyrano.
I wouldn't skip a word. Any other questions?
And
And
there was something in the chat about Walt Disney, and he did try to make a film of it, but he gave up.
oh,
There is another cartoon. You can read all about it in the Chantecler book, but there was another cartoon made. Yes.
And somebody in the chat did ask if George Orwell was inspired by Chantecler in any way.
Oh,
Well, only if he could read French. The only English production was, I think it was 1932, which of course would have been okay for Orwell, but it only lasted a week. I don't think he actually knew it at all, I'm afraid. No, I doubt it very much.
Molly.
I'm going to put you on the spot, Sue, and ask,
Yes.
Did Chantecler or Rostand have a particular impact on your life in a personal way? Like, is there some plot connection or what is the personal connection you would draw between your love for Rostand and the stories that we've seen?
Well, I don't know about just Chantecler. I just find his plays so inspiring, and they tie in with my own. I mean, Rostand didn't live up to his ideals. He was a human, you know, and I feel the same. So it encourages me when I see Rostand had these wonderful ideals, but you know. But when you read Chantecler, you will see that how he kept going was to keep doing what he considered was his work. And I find that helps me very much if I get disillusioned or fed up. Just keep going, just keep doing it, you know. That's, yes, it does have an impact.
Wonderful, thank you.
okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you will read this play and benefit from the impact that it has to offer. And we will meet again at 8 a.m. Pacific time next Sunday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue.